My name is Emily Carter, and I was 18 when I finally walked out of the only home I had ever known. People often say adulthood begins at 18. For me, 18 was the moment I stopped pretending life could be bearable there. It wasn't about independence. It was about survival. I had spent my entire childhood tiptoeing around shadows, learning which words could trigger anger, which smiles could be dangerous. The house I grew up in was not a place of love, it was a minefield, and I was just trying not to step on the wrong landmine. My sister, Claire, had been tormenting me for as long as I could remember. From the moment I was born, she seemed determined to make my existence unbearable. At first, it was small things, taking my toys, calling me names, refusing to share anything that could bring me even a sliver of happiness. But as I got older, it escalated. She would push me, snatch things from my hands, scream at me for hours for the tiniest mistake. And always, my parents would look the other way. "She's just sensitive," they would say. "She can't help it. You need to understand." I was the one expected to understand. I was the one expected to tolerate. I was the one who had to disappear in my own home. Birthdays were the worst. Every year, I would wake up full of hope, thinking maybe this year would be different. Maybe my parents would finally make me feel like I mattered. But by mid-morning, Claire would have exploded, screaming, throwing things, turning what was supposed to be a day of celebration into a disaster. My parents, instead of intervening, would hush me gently. "Be patient," they whispered. "She's special. She doesn't mean it." Special. That word became the excuse for every bruise, every humiliation, every tear I shed in silence. Special was the reason my feelings never mattered, the reason I learned to hide, to shrink, to become invisible. By the time I was 10, I had memorized the patterns. I learned to anticipate Claire's moods, to lower my expectations, to speak softly and only when spoken to. I became a ghost in my own home, fading into walls, floors, and shadows. My parents never once asked me how I felt. They never once considered that perhaps the problem wasn't me, that maybe Claire's behavior was unacceptable, regardless of her struggles. They just wanted peace, Claire's peace, and I was the price they were willing to pay. School wasn't any better. Claire made sure of that. She would tell my friends I was annoying, she would embarrass me during class, and sometimes she would even physically threaten me in front of teachers. And still, my parents' response remained the same: "You're overreacting." "She doesn't mean it." Overreacting. Me. A 10-year-old, walking on eggshells, terrified of my sister, terrified of being blamed for everything that went wrong. I remember one winter morning when I was 13. I had saved up a small allowance to buy a winter coat I desperately needed. I had picked out the perfect one and carefully tucked the receipt into my pocket, proud that I could do something for myself. Claire found out. She tore the coat from me, threw it across the room, and laughed when I tried to pick it up. My mother came in minutes later and said, "It's just a coat, Emily. Don't make a fuss." That day, I realized the truth about my parents. They were not my protectors. They had never been my protectors. And from that moment on, I started planning my escape, not in some dramatic fantasy, but quietly, logically, like a person who knows she has to survive. Every small humiliation, every ignored scream, every tear shed alone was a brick in the wall I was building around myself. By 16, I had perfected the art of disappearing while living under the same roof as my tormentor. I didn't laugh in front of Claire. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't hope for birthdays, holidays, or praise. I lived quietly, cautiously, always measuring, always calculating. I had dreams, yes, small, quiet dreams of a life where I could breathe without fear, but I kept them to myself. I had learned early that dreams were dangerous in our house. Dreams were weapons my sister could destroy, and my parents would do nothing. But the breaking point came one rainy afternoon, when I was 17, sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by scattered papers and half-packed bags. Claire had destroyed my journal, the one place I dared write my thoughts. She had thrown my textbooks in the puddles forming near my window. My parents had told me to forgive her, to let it go, to remember she didn't mean it. That day, something inside me snapped. Not with anger, not with tears, though I had plenty of those, but with the cold, clear understanding that my family would never see me as a person. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't Emily. I was a resource. A caretaker in training for someone else's needs, someone else's emotions, someone else's life. And suddenly, the idea of leaving became not a dream but a necessity. Not a rebellion. Not a fantasy. A survival instinct. I started researching colleges far away, places where no one would know me, where I could vanish and rebuild from scratch. I planned quietly, secretly, like someone who had learned not to trust the people she was supposed to trust most. Nights were spent filling out applications, writing essays, and imagining a world where I could finally exist without fear. Every day at home was endured with calculated patience, knowing that the day I would leave would come soon. And when it did, nothing could stop me. Because by 18, I had learned the most important truth about my life. Love in that house was conditional. And I was never, not once, the one who had earned it. Turning 17 felt like stepping onto a bridge I had already built in my mind. Every day at home reminded me why I had to leave. Claire's outbursts had become more unpredictable, her aggression more intense. I had learned to move silently, to keep my head down, to avoid triggering her moods. My parents. They still claimed to love me, but their actions, or lack thereof, told a different story. Love, in their world, meant sacrificing myself for Claire. And I had finally decided I was done sacrificing. It wasn't easy to plan my exit. The thought of leaving brought a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I had no financial support, no one in the house who would truly protect me if things went wrong. But what I lacked in resources, I made up for in clarity. I started researching colleges that were far enough away to make any sudden visit impossible, with campuses big enough to allow me to disappear into a crowd. I applied to scholarships, part-time jobs, and dormitories, everything that could guarantee me independence. I wrote down every possible scenario, what I would do if they refused to let me go, how I would pay for transportation, what to pack first. I became meticulous. Quietly meticulous. At school, I put on the mask of a normal teenager. I smiled at friends, laughed at their jokes, talked about college plans in general terms. No one could suspect the storm brewing inside me. Inside, I was counting days, calculating the exact moment when my freedom would finally be mine. It was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. I had never allowed myself to hope for anything like this before. But now, hope had to be disciplined. Hope had to be carefully folded into every plan, every step, every letter and essay. I remember the night I finally confronted my parents. I was 17 and a half, standing in the kitchen with my application packet clutched to my chest. Claire had thrown yet another tantrum over something insignificant, a spilled cup of juice, and my parents were once again apologizing to her while quietly dismissing me. I had had enough. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady. Not a whisper, not a plea. A statement. I expected arguments, screaming, tears, perhaps even guilt trips that would make me break down. But the initial reaction was silence. Silence heavy enough to feel physical. Then my mother spoke, her voice quivering. "Emily, you can't just leave. Claire needs you." I felt a chill run through me. 4 years, their words had drilled into me that I existed to serve, to support, to sacrifice. And now they were saying it outright. "I'm done being needed for someone else's life," I said. "I need to live mine." My father's face twisted in confusion and anger. "You're abandoning us," he shouted. But I wasn't abandoning them. I was abandoning the life they had made impossible to endure. I wasn't leaving because I hated them. I was leaving because I had to survive. The conversation escalated. My mother cried, trying to guilt me, reminding me of my responsibility, of the years I had spent keeping Claire's world stable. She begged me to reconsider, to wait until graduation, to at least let them help me pack. But I had already planned everything. I had memorized the bus schedules, saved money for my part-time job, and hidden the most important documents in my backpack. Nothing could stop me now. The more they pleaded, the more resolute I became. Later that night, I lay in my bed listening to Claire storm around the house, throwing things, slamming doors, and screaming in a rage that had nothing to do with me and yet everything to do with me. My parents had gone to their rooms, hoping to avoid the chaos, hoping perhaps that ignoring it would make it disappear. I closed my eyes and felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in my life, I realized something fundamental. I was not responsible for anyone else's happiness. I didn't have to mediate, negotiate, or endure anymore. I had my own life to live. That realization changed everything. It wasn't anger that propelled me forward. It was clarity. The clarity that had been missing from my childhood, obscured by fear, by obedience, by the constant need to appease a bully and parents who enabled her. The clarity that told me my existence mattered outside of my family's expectations, outside of Claire's tantrums, outside of the household that had never been a home for me. In the weeks that followed, I became both invisible and unstoppable. I kept up appearances at home, keeping my voice low, my steps quiet, my reactions minimal. At the same time, I gathered everything I would need: documents, applications, money saved from odd jobs, small mementos that carried the essence of me. I packed in secret, making lists, checking them twice, as though my life depended on it, because it did. Every evening, I rehearsed the moment I would walk out the door. How I would say goodbye to the familiar, without pleading, without hesitation, without fear. I also started mentally preparing for the aftermath. My parents would not understand, would not forgive, would not see this as necessary for my well-being. They might try to guilt me, to threaten me, even to block my path. I knew that now. I had rehearsed the words I would say. I am not abandoning you. I am choosing myself. I am finally living my life. I had rehearsed the silence I would maintain when they begged or cried, and I had practiced walking away with dignity, with quiet resolve. By the end of my 17th year, the plan was in place, the timing calculated, and my heart steeled. I was terrified, yes, but it was a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being hurt, of being trapped, of being invisible. This was the fear of stepping into the unknown, of finally leaving the only life I had ever known, of facing the world on my own terms. But underneath that fear was an even stronger force: the need to live, fully and freely, without having to manage someone else's life to survive. And so, I waited for the day that would finally come, the day I would walk out the door at 18, leaving behind the house that had never been my home, leaving behind the people who had never truly seen me. I didn't know what lay ahead, only that the moment I stepped forward, everything would change. The morning I left home, the air felt different, sharp, crisp, like the world outside had been waiting for me all along. My parents didn't stop me. My father muttered something about responsibility, my mother tried to hand me a sweater, but I didn't look back. For years, I had been trained to shrink, to make myself small, to avoid trouble. That day, I took up space. Every step I took down the driveway was a reclamation of myself. My backpack was heavy with books, papers, and a few clothes, but my heart was even heavier, with relief, with anticipation, with fear, and with the strange exhilaration of stepping into the unknown. I called my grandmother on the drive to her house. Her voice, calm but firm, was the first warm sound I had heard in years. "I'll be here in an hour," she said. "Don't worry about anything else. Just come." That promise, simple as it was, felt like a lifeline. When I arrived, she embraced me like I had been missing for decades, not days. Her arms carried no judgment, no shame, only the certainty that I had finally arrived where I belonged, somewhere I could breathe. Living with her was a revelation. For the first time, I didn't have to tiptoe. I didn't have to strategize my movements around someone else's moods. I could sit in silence without fearing an explosion. I could read, write, and even cry without anyone interrupting. The sense of peace was almost disorienting, but I clung to it. Slowly, I started to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years: safety. Yet freedom didn't erase the scars overnight. College applications, part-time work, and the logistics of independence fell squarely on my shoulders. Unlike my peers, my parents weren't sending money, checking in, or offering guidance. I had to learn everything on my own, from opening a bank account to navigating public transportation, to budgeting every dollar so it would stretch through rent, groceries, and essentials. Exhaustion became my constant companion, but so did resilience. Each challenge I overcame built the first bricks of confidence I had ever laid for myself. Socially, I struggled at first. Making friends was tricky when I had spent most of my teenage years learning to disappear. I feared being noticed too much, exposing weakness, or letting someone care enough to hurt me again. But slowly, I began to open up, cautiously, revealing fragments of who I really was. I found allies in professors, classmates, and colleagues who treated me like a person, not an obligation. Every kind word, every simple smile, was a small reminder that life could be different, that people could see me without fear, without judgment, without the constant shadow of Claire looming over me. My grandmother remained my anchor. She never pried about my past, never forced me to forgive my parents or Claire. She simply provided a stable presence, helping me navigate adulthood while letting me find my own strength. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit with me in the kitchen, quietly knitting or sipping tea, while I talked about my fears, my small victories, or even the lingering loneliness. She never rushed me, never judged me for leaving home, and never dismissed my pain. For the first time, I understood what unconditional love looked like. Yet the past had a way of following me. Small reminders, a phone call from my mother ignored, a text from my father left unanswered, would stir old insecurities. I had to relearn what it meant to value myself, to separate my worth from how I had been treated. Slowly, painfully, I realized that leaving had been only the first step. Healing, understanding, and growing into myself would take years. But every day, as I walked across the campus, counted bills, or sat quietly in my room without fear of being yelled at, I could feel myself becoming the person I had always wanted to be. There were moments of guilt, too. Moments when I wondered if I had abandoned my family, if I had left them to deal with Claire alone. But each time, I reminded myself of the years of neglect, the constant pressure to sacrifice myself, the silent suffering that had been expected of me. Walking away was not abandonment, it was survival. And survival was something no one had taught me to value, not until I had made it my own. By the time I turned 18 and started my first semester at college, I had transformed in ways I could barely articulate. I was still Emily Carter, but I was also someone stronger, sharper, and more determined. Every small success, an A on a paper, a paycheck, a friendly conversation, felt monumental. Every act of independence was a declaration. I existed for myself now, not for anyone else. For the first time in my life, I understood that freedom wasn't just a physical distance from my parents or Claire. Freedom was the right to make choices without fear. Freedom was the ability to prioritize myself without guilt. Freedom was realizing that the person I had been forced to be, silent, compliant, invisible, was only a survival mechanism. The real me had finally arrived. And while the world outside my grandparents' house was intimidating, overwhelming, and full of unknowns, it was mine. I had finally stepped into it, carrying nothing but my own courage, determination, and the quiet conviction that I would never again let someone else define my worth. College was a world I had only dared to imagine from my bedroom window years ago. The campus was vast, bustling with energy, and filled with people who didn't know me, or my past. At first, it was overwhelming. I had spent so long in survival mode that navigating freedom felt foreign. Each morning, I forced myself out of bed, packed my books, and walked to classes without the constant shadow of fear pressing on me. And slowly, day by day, I discovered that the world could be gentle, that people could be trustworthy, and that I could exist without constantly bracing for disaster. The first semester was rough, not because the work was too hard, but because I had to learn to advocate for myself in a way I had never been allowed to. I had to speak up, make decisions, and take responsibility for my life entirely on my own. No one was there to shield me or smooth things over if I stumbled. And yet, for the first time, I felt alive. Each small victory, turning in a paper on time, earning a paycheck from my part-time job, forming friendships, was a reminder that I was capable. I could survive. I could thrive. I could be Emily Carter, unapologetically. Yet even as I built this new life, the past lurked quietly in the corners of my mind. I found myself replaying old arguments with my parents, reviewing every instance of Claire's cruelty, analyzing how I had been blamed for everything that went wrong. These memories were heavy, but I refused to let them dictate my future. I realized that my survival wasn't just about leaving the house, it was about reclaiming the narrative of my life. I was no longer the girl who had to endure, hide, and appease. I was the woman who could set boundaries, make choices, and protect herself emotionally. It was during my sophomore year that I first heard of Claire's troubles. A neighbor mentioned something in passing, a call to the police, complaints from parents in the neighborhood, Claire screaming at children. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that the world outside my home was finally seeing what I had lived with for years, and disbelief that my parents, who had enabled her behavior for so long, had allowed it to escalate this far. Part of me wanted to intervene, to step in and fix what I couldn't fix when I was a child. But I had to remind myself, I had done my part by walking away. She was someone else's responsibility now. Meanwhile, my parents began to make tentative efforts to contact me. The first attempts were small, text messages asking how I was, birthday wishes, polite inquiries about school. I ignored most of them, replying only when it suited me, carefully measuring my responses to maintain my autonomy. Their messages were polite, almost rehearsed, but I could sense the underlying desperation. They wanted to reconnect, but I wasn't sure whether they wanted to see me or simply needed me for their own emotional comfort. I approached these interactions cautiously. I had spent years learning to anticipate disappointment, to expect manipulation, and to endure pain in silence. I knew that answering too quickly or letting my guard down could mean getting pulled back into the dynamic I had escaped. So I responded with brief, neutral messages, never volunteering information, never showing vulnerability. I wanted them to know that I could maintain a relationship on my terms, not theirs. During this time, my life outside of my family began to flourish. I joined clubs, made friends who genuinely cared, and even started mentoring younger students who reminded me of myself. Sharing my experiences in small ways, without exposing the full trauma, became empowering. I realized that surviving didn't just mean leaving home, it meant building a life that I could be proud of, one where I could help others while honoring my own boundaries. Financial independence was harder than I had anticipated. I worked long hours at part-time jobs, studied late into the night, and sometimes went without luxuries that other students took for granted. But with each paycheck, I felt a growing sense of agency. Every dollar earned was a symbol of my autonomy, a tangible reminder that I was no longer anyone else's caretaker or emotional crutch. I was building my life from the ground up, and it was mine alone. Occasionally, my parents would call, trying different approaches. One day, my mother asked if I could help Claire with something, an appointment, a school issue, a trivial favor. I refused. Calmly, firmly, I reminded them that I was no longer responsible for Claire's actions. The conversation ended with awkward silence, and I felt a surge of empowerment. I could finally enforce boundaries they had never respected. I didn't owe them my compliance, and I didn't owe Claire my presence. By the end of my college years, I had grown into a confident, self-sufficient young woman. I still carried the scars of my childhood, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to navigate the world on my own terms, to advocate for myself, and to protect my emotional well-being. And while I still occasionally thought about my family, about the girl I had been, I knew that I had made the right choice in leaving. I had chosen myself, and for the first time in my life, that choice felt sacred. Even with all this progress, one lesson remained clear. Freedom was not simply the act of leaving home. Freedom was learning to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to build a life unencumbered by those who had failed to see me. And in that, I finally found a peace that my childhood had denied me, a quiet, steady assurance that I could survive anything, and that my voice, my needs, and my life mattered. Years had passed since I left home, and in that time, I had built a life that belonged solely to me. College was behind me, my career was taking off, and I had learned the immense value of independence. Yet, life has a way of reminding us that the past never fully disappears. One evening, my grandmother called with news I had long anticipated but never truly wanted to hear. Claire had finally crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. She had gotten into trouble with the law, behaving violently toward others in the neighborhood. My parents, who had shielded her for years, could no longer hide from the consequences of their neglect. Hearing this, I felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, relief, and a pang of guilt. For years, I had been the one punished, the one silenced, the one overlooked. And now, finally, the world outside our home was paying attention to the chaos I had lived under. But I reminded myself, I was not responsible. I had done my part by surviving, by leaving, and by building a life that allowed me to heal. This was not my burden to carry anymore. Then came the call I had been dreading. My parents reached out. It was tentative, awkward, and desperate. My father's voice sounded older, thinner, weighed down by guilt. My mother's words trembled as she asked if we could meet, if I could come back to help. I listened quietly, holding the phone as though it were a fragile artifact. They wanted my assistance, not my forgiveness, not my presence, but my utility. They wanted someone to fix the mess they had created for decades. And for the first time, I realized how much strength I had truly gained. I could hear their plea, their desperation, and I could respond not from fear or obligation, but from choice. I told them calmly, firmly, that I would not be taking responsibility for Claire. I would not finance her therapy, mediate her conflicts, or clean up the consequences of a childhood that had never been mine to manage. Their silence on the other end was heavy, broken only by the occasional sniffle or whispered apology. They tried to guilt me, tried to remind me of my duty as a sister, tried to appeal to my lingering compassion. But I had spent years cultivating the clarity that had been denied to me as a child. I knew my worth. I knew my boundaries. And I knew that protecting myself was no longer negotiable. The legal consequences for Claire became unavoidable. She was mandated into therapy and placed under strict supervision. Court dates were set, restraining orders enforced, and for the first time, there were tangible consequences that my parents could no longer circumvent. Watching this unfold, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, not from revenge, but from justice. The world was finally doing what my parents had refused to do, holding her accountable. And though part of me grieved for the childhood I had lost, another part exhaled for the first time in decades. My parents, now humbled and desperate, attempted to reconnect. The first meetings were tentative, filled with awkward pauses, uncomfortable admissions, and fragile apologies. They admitted their failures, acknowledged their neglect, and tried to bridge the gap created by years of inaction. And yet, I realized that reconciliation does not equate to erasing pain. Their apologies were steps, not solutions. My healing had been built independently of them, brick by brick, choice by choice. Their regret could not replace the years of silence, the bruises ignored, the birthdays ruined, or the emotional labor demanded. During one of these conversations, my mother said something that lingered long after the call ended. "We should have protected you. We should have seen you as more than just a caretaker for Claire." Her words were heavy with guilt, but I had long since learned that hearing the truth was not the same as needing to forgive. I listened, acknowledged, and then returned to my life. My boundaries remained intact. I understood that their remorse could exist alongside my independence, but it could not dictate it. This period marked a crucial turning point. I began to see my parents and Claire not as the center of my world, but as figures whose choices no longer held dominion over my life. I could engage cautiously, maintain civility, and protect my emotional space. I could be compassionate without sacrificing my well-being. And perhaps most importantly, I realized that my silence, the years I had withheld anger, withheld tears, withheld confrontation, had not made me weak. It had prepared me for this moment of clarity, for this moment of self-possession. I also began to reflect on the girl I had been, the one who had learned to disappear in her own home to survive. I wanted to tell her that leaving had been the right decision, that survival was not betrayal, and that claiming your life is never selfish. I realized that the strength I now possessed was born from endurance, from the ability to rise above neglect, and from the unwavering decision to prioritize my own well-being. That girl, silenced and overlooked for years, had become someone capable of choosing, asserting, and protecting herself in ways she never could have imagined. By the end of this chapter, the dynamics had shifted. Claire faced the consequences she had avoided for so long. My parents' desperation had forced a reckoning they could no longer ignore. And I, standing firmly in my life, remained untouched by their attempts to control or manipulate. The house that had once been a prison now existed only as a memory I could acknowledge without fear, without resentment, and without relinquishing my autonomy. In the quiet aftermath, I understood something fundamental. Forgiveness and reconciliation are optional. Healing is not about returning to the people who hurt you, it's about reclaiming your own story, on your own terms. And in that, I finally felt a sense of completion, a closure that no apology could have provided, a freedom that no childhood could take away, and a peace that had been decades in the making. Years had passed since I first walked out of the house that had never felt like home. Every day since had been a deliberate choice to live life on my terms. I had a career I loved, friends who truly cared, and a sense of self-worth I had fought tooth and nail to reclaim. The girl who had once shrunk in fear, who had tiptoed around Claire's moods and my parents' indifference, was now someone who commanded her space in the world, fully and unapologetically. I still thought about my parents occasionally, and the occasional messages or calls they sent were reminders of the life I had left behind. I responded carefully, not out of obligation, but because I could. I was no longer bound by guilt or the need to placate. I had discovered a truth that had been invisible to me as a child. Love and care are not measured by sacrifice or endurance, but by respect and presence. And my parents had never given me that. I had learned that I didn't need their validation to thrive. Claire's story continued without me. Legal intervention, therapy, and supervision were finally in place. I did not intervene, nor did I feel the need to. Her life, like my parents' actions, existed outside my jurisdiction. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that I was responsible for everything, that my happiness was negotiable, and that my worth was tied to someone else's well-being. Leaving had proven otherwise. My life, my choices, my peace, none of it was negotiable anymore. With each passing year, I strengthened the boundaries that had saved me. I allowed conversations with my parents only on my terms, limited to neutral topics, devoid of emotional manipulation. They could reach out, but I would not surrender my peace for their comfort. I realized that boundaries are not just defenses, they are the framework upon which a healthy life is built. They are the invisible walls that protect your heart, your mind, and your freedom. I had built mine brick by brick, and I would never tear them down for anyone who had not earned the right to be inside. Reflecting on the journey, I saw the girl I had once been, the one who endured, who survived in silence, who hid in corners to escape scrutiny. I wanted to tell her that her pain had a purpose, that leaving was not betrayal, and that the strength she had cultivated through suffering was her greatest weapon. She had learned resilience, clarity, and independence in ways most people never experience. She had become a woman who could not be shaken by neglect, indifference, or manipulation. And empowerment, I realized, was not a sudden revelation. It was incremental, built over years of small victories, of asserting boundaries, of making choices that honored my needs. It was in every paycheck earned, every room decorated for myself, every friendship nurtured without compromise, every decision made without fear of reprisal. It was the freedom to choose my life, the freedom to say no, and the freedom to live without obligation to those who had failed me. Occasionally, I allowed myself to feel a quiet triumph. The phone calls from my parents no longer held power over me. Claire's consequences were unfolding, independent of my intervention. I was no longer the invisible child, no longer the mediator, no longer the scapegoat. I existed fully for myself, and that realization brought an unshakable peace. For the first time, I could inhabit my life without fear, without compromise, without constantly calculating the emotional fallout of my existence. I also embraced the idea that forgiveness is a choice, not a requirement. I could forgive my parents or Claire if I wanted to, but it would be for me, not for them. And if I chose not to, that too was valid. Healing does not demand reconciliation. Freedom does not demand compromise. And peace does not require the consent of those who once caused your suffering. Now, standing firmly in my life, I could see the trajectory of my growth. Every setback I endured, every moment of silence, every tear cried in secret, had prepared me for this life, one of autonomy, self-respect, and genuine happiness. I had traded fear for courage, obligation for choice, and invisibility for presence. I was no longer surviving, I was living, fully, unapologetically, and without hesitation. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I reflect on the girl I once was. I tell her this: you were never too much. You were never wrong. You were never selfish for wanting more. Walking away didn't make you heartless. It made you free. And that freedom is your greatest inheritance, a gift that no one can take away, a life finally lived on your terms. I am not defined by the neglect I endured, nor by the cruelty I faced. I am defined by the choices I made to reclaim myself, to build my life, and to honor my worth. I am the woman I always needed to be, and nothing, not my past, not my parents, not Claire, can undo that. I left home at 18, yes, but I didn't just leave a house. I left behind fear, invisibility, and obligation. I stepped into my life. And now my silence, the years I withheld anger, tears, and confrontation, does more than shock them. It defines me. I am free.